too much about what we're doing. Okay, so I've been uploading everything. I've heard from a few students. We're now kind of getting into that. We've kind of finished the review and overview. Someone was kind enough to read the BCA overview. It had some typos in it. This is normal. Just let me warn you. Typing, I make a lot of typos because I'm constantly trying to do about 5 things at once. So I try to correct them. And, you know, that's always a battle. I always think the grammar checker is going to catch me or the spell checker, and it doesn't do it. So anyway, this is where we are now. Is we're really going to start looking at these chapter by chapter lectures with the homework and the assignments. I checked the YouTube, so I'll try and correct the problems I saw on that. Kind of mostly it's a visual, but I'm also uploading the PowerPoints I'm using and the files, so you can open those and listen to the YouTube or view the YouTube at the same time, so you can zero in on what you're interested in. You can also stop the YouTube. That's very effective. There's also old YouTubes. If you didn't like the one I did this time, maybe you could go back. They're not very well titled initially, but I've started actually paying a lot more attention to the titles. And again, the homeworks, homework 1, assignment 1, are really to be done as you're reading chapter 2. We do not start by reading chapter 1. It's very confusing. Also, if you're having problem with Excel, you can actually search YouTube for other Excel videos. Most of what I'm teaching here is really relative to what we need to do the homework for the class. But if you know nothing about Excel, you might want to update yourself by looking at Excel YouTubes. Or you can ask me privately. And then for the graduate students, this is supposed to be basic stuff that you might already know. I understand that. So if you want to go ahead and work faster, that's fine. But for the undergraduates, don't feel pressed. You have a lot of time. I'll follow up with you as we go through. If I haven't heard from you in a week, you'll all be hearing from me, those I have not heard from. So let's get started. So we're really going to look at what's going on in the book in chapter 2. I sent an email basically directing you to specific pages. I'm going to go over what I think to be the biggest problems and talk about why we're really needing to pay attention to this particular issue. And so now I'm going to try to share screen, do my PowerPoint, and try and get us on the slideshow a little quicker this time because it works so much better. Okay, so let me kind of move you over a little bit on this. I noticed on the YouTube that these pictures were kind of getting in the way, so we're going to try and move those over. So a lot of what students worry about, and actually what everybody worries about, is what is this discount rate? The discount rate is really important because basically, as I've talked about in a previous lecture, it really reflects our values. For me, the opportunity cost of waiting really reflects what's important to me. If I'm ready and able to wait, I will have a different discount rate than if I'm not. And for certain things, I can wait. For other things, I cannot. Again, for the poor, if you're expecting the poor to change their behavior, that's going to be relative to sustainability. It's going to be very difficult. Because to be sustainable, again, we have to have a really, really, really low, zero discount rate. But if you're very poor and you don't even have enough to get through the week, then you're really going to have a very, very high discount rate because you can't wait for anything. You can barely feed yourself. You're not going to locate it in an area where you're going to be worrying about the environment. You're going to go to an area that may be environmentally fragile. You're going to have a very big need for social stuff, social support, and you may have a very weak social system to rely upon. You may be in a community where you don't have a lot of social capital, where you can actually get support from that community. So that makes it very difficult. So we have to kind of worry about that. So we really are going to spend a lot of time today talking about the discount rate. How should you use it? Where do you get the data? How does this go? And we're going to talk about some specific problems, and I'll give you an example on Excel. Oh, yeah, that's right. It doesn't work. Okay. So review now the opportunity cost to weight in. This is what economists are into. We're very into opportunity costs. And what are they? So it's what you lose if you don't do the next best alternative. So the assumption here, and what I've kind of said, is that we always kind of get down to our best two options and we're trying to weigh them. We could have three options, but at least we think we have two. And this is always something that some people like to portray as, oh, I had no options. But for an economist, we always think that there's an option, even if you're really poor. And I know a lot of people may take offense, but we always say that you have wants, you don't have needs. Yes, you need food, you think, but the reality is you could eat very, very cheaply and you make choices. If you want to have a local sustainable food supply, you might have to actually pay a lot more for food. So that's actually a choice from the point of view of an economist. So one of the things you'll lose is that you actually won't be spending on that other option. So you'll actually be spending on this one instead of that one. So what this one costs is actually what you save by doing that one. So it seems a little bit redundant, but in actuality, once you start doing cost benefit, you'll see that it's very practical type of thinking. So you're actually not spending on this stuff, but that stuff. And then you're also not doing additional things associated with that investment. There's alternative investments. Another reason why you have an opportunity cost of waiting, again now, opportunity cost of waiting. You can spend money on stuff, you can invest in other options. You also want to be compensated for inflation. Every year you wait, that dollar may go down in value. So you need to be compensated for that. I'm not sure what the current inflation rates are. They're pretty low right now, but still, even if it's 4% inflation, 2% inflation, that means $1 today is worth 2% less in a year. That's all it means. You just buy 2% less. And that's why, particularly when you're looking at investments, for me, for example, one of the investments that's always pegged with inflation is real estate. When you have rental housing, you always can increase that rental rate relative to inflation. But if you're investing in the stock market doesn't really respond as much to inflation. It's another issue. Stock market is really something where you're more compensated for your risk. So if you're investing in a riskier stock, you're expecting a higher return. Sorry. So that's an issue that you need to worry about. And the people in finance worry about this a lot, this compensation for risk, because a lot of times they're looking at things like stock market investments in groups of stocks. Bonds are usually considered less risky because it's debt. But if you're investing in other people's companies, what companies are hot, what companies are not? That's always an issue. For example, if you were investing in airlines, you are really suffering because they have really gone down. If you are investing in Main Street places like all those storefront places, Nordstrom's is in trouble. Neiman's is in trouble. Macy's is in trouble. Pizza Hut is having problems. Dunkin' Donuts is cutting back. So anything where there's a storefront rather than ordering on the internet like Amazon is doing great. But if you actually have a Main Street store, that's something you're going to be worried about. So that is a risk when you're investing in the stock market in other people's companies. So that finance people spend a lot of time worrying about how to account for risk. Do we get the benefit that we expect? When there is a probability that the benefit may not be what you expect, then that's risk. If you know that probability, and that's what finance people spend a lot of time doing, there's a degree of investigation. There, it's called stochastic dominance. There's first degree, second degree. First degree is average. Second degree is variation around the average, standard deviation. And third degree really has to do with the shape of the distributions a little bit more. So this is a lot of times what you would do for the graduate students who are looking at very sophisticated analysis of risk. And when we get to that section, we'll actually talk about software you can use that goes with Excel, that you can use in your cost benefit analysis to estimate variation and distributions, to deal with looking at second and third degree stochastic dominance in deciding what that benefit does. So we're going to really talk about how we can begin sort of accounting for these. We're going to start very simply with just inflation, because that one is the easiest one, because you don't have to really investigate the nature of it. It's just, you go to the government website, this is the inflation rate, easy to deal with. So that's something that's quicker for us. Risk is much more complicated because it requires these software and a lot of data points. So we're not going to talk about that in the undergraduate level. Okay, so we're going to account for things. So let's start looking at, again, interest rates, because this is really reflecting all that stuff, all our values, all the situations in the world is really reflected a lot in that interest rate. It's very amazing how preoccupied we are with it, and I think it's for good reason, actually. So we have something called the real rate. And the real rate is actually synonymous with that opportunity cost of what you lost because you didn't invest in that alternative investment. So both investments would probably have the same inflation rates or be subject to the same inflation rates. So you're really talking about the difference between what you made with this one versus what you made with that one. And economists assume that funds will go to their highest and best use. So these rates will be changing, but they're very difficult to observe, because when we look at a rate in the newspaper, that's going to be not a real rate. Because how's the newspaper going to know what your next best alternative was? That's kind of impossible. In fact, who knows what that next best alternative rate was going to be, because we didn't pick it and we don't know what it did. So even if we looked it up in the newspaper, that would not necessarily be a real rate. So it cannot be observed in the real world. And that really makes it difficult, because what we really would like to do is really focus in on what am I giving up by not taking that other option. If we were really able to do that, it would be perfect. Problem is, very difficult to do. So what we see in the newspaper is something called the nominal or the money rate. So the nominal or the money rate is the real rate plus inflation rate. So when you look in the paper, or you look at any source of an interest rate, that will be a nominal or a money rate, because you cannot pull out the effect of inflation. Those rates will always reflect inflation, and as inflation changes, they will adjust, but the time frames and how they affect each different rate that you may be looking at, like a home mortgage rate, is much different than a treasury bill rate, is much different than the rate you pay on your Visa card. How much are you paying for your Visa debt? 10%, 12%. That's a money rate. But how much do you get when you put money into a savings account? 1%, 2%. These are much different rates. So if you're saving money in a savings account, it's much different than if you're buying, say, rental property, or you're investing in treasury bills, or you're going to the stock market. It's very, very difficult. So these are some of the problems that you're going to have when you actually get out in the real world and try to work on a benefit cost analysis. So you can see rates in the news, but which one you need is difficult to figure out. Also, inflation is hard to predict. Usually when we get data, it's historical data. You can get experts who can make some predictions, but they'll only do predictions about a year or two in advance. They're not going to be predicting a rate in 5 years or 10 years. And frankly, I'm going to be really honest, economists are having a bit of a problem recently with the inflation rate, because usually if inflation is high, then that means the economy is really heated up. So we have a relationship that we think we're looking for, but it's been lately very, very difficult to figure out. And what we're having is situations where you have inflation, but you don't really have heated up economies. In Europe, there was like no investment, and they couldn't figure out why, because they're looking at the interest rate saying, well, it's really low, but still no investment. So what's going on with all this? And then how does it inflect the inflation rate? So it's been a very difficult couple of years. And I think it's now going to get worse because you're going to have an economic slump associated with a pandemic. And then how do you get the economy jump started again? Usually you do this by lowering rates, but rates are already pretty low. So people are not borrowing money and putting them in projects because they can't identify projects that are profitable. When you can't identify projects that are profitable, no matter what the interest rate, you're not going to be investing because you've got to identify a profitable project. And this is a problem because if we don't have investment, we don't have potential for future growth. So this is a complicated time for economists. It will be interesting to see how it all shakes out. Now, if you wanted to use a risk-adjusted rate, you could actually envision the concept of a risk-free rate plus the risk rate of the investment. And this is what a lot of finance people they try to actually analyze. I think it used to be called betas. I'm not sure it's still called that now, but they would actually try to analyze the risks associated with different types of investments. For example, what's the category of stocks that are high-risk stocks, high-growth stocks? You wouldn't pick a high-risk stock unless it was high growth. You don't take risk without a higher expected return. You want to have an expectation of making more money, or don't take the risk. Never take a risk unless you think you're going to get more money. So for example, if you were thinking, oh, I want to go into the stock market used to return around 12 to 13% on average. And I think it's dropped after the turn of the century. And then it came up a little bit after 2008, once we got through the problems associated with what we went through with the 9/11 and all those problems. So then it started to pick back up in about 2011, 2012, and it's done pretty well, but now this year again, it's tanking. So with the stock market, it's a very long-term investment. I usually say you're expecting around 10 to 11%, but any given year, you don't know what you'll get. So that's a risky investment as opposed to a less risky investment, say in my case, rental property. My return maybe by the time I deducted all these other things, maybe is better because it doesn't vary as much for me. But if you were younger, I would really encourage going into the stock market. But as you're older, I recommend to people get a rental property. You won't make as much money as you might in the stock market on any given year, but it's a guaranteed thing. It's not going to go away. It's not volatile. It doesn't go up and down. So these are all very interesting things, but they're difficult to figure out. So we're going to try and make this as simple as possible. What do you do for this class? Because we got some homeworks and we got to figure this out. Okay. So in general, the risk-free rate is considered the government treasury bill. We're thinking the federal government is never going to default on debt. They have a structure where you can look up that interest rate, and that's generally considered the risk-free rate. So at least there we have a proxy that we use for the risk-free rate. And then you would have to figure out what's the risk rate of the investment, which is why we have a lot of people very interested in finance in great business schools around the world, including at Manoa. So let's talk a little bit about this real rate. If you're using a real rate to discount, then you do not adjust the yearly net benefits. You just discount them as they are. So this is the simplest one to use. This is what I tend to use just because it's simpler, so I don't have to be sitting there thinking about inflation 6 years from now. Very difficult. Very easy to use. You don't adjust for inflation just because it's very hard. And probably the real reason I use it is because current values are very relatable. It's easy for me to estimate what a property would rent for. All I got to do is go on Craigslist and check out what's available for rent, or go in the newspaper, what's available for rent. Then I know what current values are. I don't have to worry about projecting into the future. While economists love to project in the future, this is some of the stuff we love to do. It's difficult. You don't always know if you're right. Takes a lot of time, takes a lot of energy. Getting that data, is the data right? Is your model the best model? It's very complicated. So I like to go with current values because I can find them. You can look up current stock values. It's also, frankly, the most conservative method. Most accountants are very, very conservative, very, very conservative. And I think that it's a good idea to be conservative, because as long as I make the money I wanted to make, I feel good. But I don't want to get too far out there visioning that I'm going to make all this money. That's not what I'm here for. That's not what drives me. I'm quite happy to supply, in my case, nice places for people to live that are not really high end, just nice, clean, safe, well-constructed places. So to me, that's a conservative approach, and that's consistent with the way I do my analyses for cost benefit analysis. So now let's look at the nominal or money rate. This one's very easy to observe because you can just go right to wherever you're going to get this money, or look at yourself and come up with a number. It's very, very easy to figure out. There's tons of information about rates everywhere. Every time I get on CNN, they're talking to me about mortgage rates. If you have any mortgages, they're hounding you with mortgage information on how cheap it is or whatever. So I don't ever have a problem finding nominal rates. They chase me around. However, when you do your CBA, it does mean a lot more work because you have to adjust all those net benefits every year to account for inflation. Otherwise, this isn't going to work. So what you've got to do is figure out, for example, year one, whatever that year one net benefit is, you have to have that net benefit. Then you have to add in the inflation rate. So this would be 1 plus the inflation rate, would be this multiplication right here. It says times the inflation rate, but the inflation rate is like what it was year 0 plus what it went up in year 2. So that's kind of how that works. And then when you do it for year N or any other year, then you have the net benefit plus all that inflation. So every year you have got to adjust for that inflation. So you're really accounting for inflation on top of inflation. So this is why it's more difficult to figure it out, because you have to do an extra step. And this is why it's not very conservative, because who gets inflation on inflation? But this is kind of real. When you buy a new car, you've probably never experienced this. When you buy your first new car, I think my first new car was $5,000. This was many, many years ago. It was brand new. A little Honda, that little old style Honda Civic, $5,000. Wow. When I bought my next one, it was many, many, many years later. And I think that one was like $25,000. That's inflation on inflation. Every year it goes up and up and we don't notice it. And that's called sticker shock, because this compounding of inflation makes things very, very expensive when you haven't annually looked at how prices went up. This is one of the situations we have in Hawaii with leasehold. We have a real estate situation where you don't buy the land. Every year you pay a lease rent. Those lease rents were fixed for like 30 years. And then when the owner of the land realized how valuable the land in Hawaii became, They really, really increased the lease rent because they went so many years without an increase. So in order to get it up to market, because of inflation, that increase was huge. And a lot of older people basically lost their homes because they couldn't afford to buy the land and they couldn't afford the lease anymore. And they had no idea that this was happening because they're not tracking inflation. So this is one of the reasons that people are actually interested in accounting for the effect of inflation, because you would be amazed how something 10 years ago was this price and now it's much more expensive. It's shocking. But if you tracked it every year using this formula, you would see how it went up. And you're basically really looking at situations where it's inflation of inflation because it compounds. Very difficult. This is also the least conservative method because it will bring a much higher number to net benefits. The net benefits will look much more attractive if you have high inflation rates in your formulas. So it will always be larger if inflation is greater than 0. The nominal or money rate will always produce a larger NPV. And that's going to lead you, once that NPV is bigger, then you're going to pick the one with the highest NPV. As long as the NPV is 0 or greater, you're going to tend to want to go with the one with the biggest NPV, and this will lead to some important implications if the inflation rate does not turn out as you thought it was going to. That might make the investment look less rosy than it was when you initially analyzed it. So this is the problem. Now, if you're doing a risk-adjusted rate, then you're just going to add a premium to it. And that premium, again, as I suggested, should be pegged to how those benefits vary, which in second-degree stochastic dominance is the standard deviation or the variance in a typical statistical calculation. Excel can do that. But again, when you're doing statistics, you're assuming a certain distribution, a normal distribution. Returns sometimes don't have that. So you can actually, for the graduate students, estimate what those distributions are and look really at a third-degree stochastic dominance when you calculate your risk premium. A little complicated, but surely worth your time and energy if this is the type of work that you want to do. And so if you're really a financial analyst, this is the type of stuff you're going to want to get information on and learn more about. And there are add-ons to Excel that allow you to easily do this if this is something you want to do as a consultant. Very useful. And when you folks actually look at these financial planners, this is kind of stuff that they do. They do all this discounting for you, and they have you estimate all these net benefits you think you want or can produce and how long you want to wait and what your discount rate is. They actually ask you to estimate it, and then all they're doing is running these CBAs for you and giving you back what you want to hear, or not necessarily what you want to hear, but what goes with your data. However, this is kind of complex just for 1 or 2 projects. Oh, I just have a couple of alternatives. They're not really financial. Maybe they're more a lot of non-market stuff just to help the community. It's really not something you may want to get into for that level of analysis because the data is going to be so hard to get. It's hard enough to just get regular data, let alone all these time series to actually look at variances, standard deviations, and distributions of returns. Very complex. So let me just show you what the federal government puts out, because they actually put out what's called the OMB circular. And you notice here that the government actually does you a favor for those of you looking at government projects or analyzing CBAs for government projects. They actually tell you nominal discount rates and real discount rates. They give you estimates. Okay, so they're saying for government projects, here's the rates you should use. And it's right on this OMB circular. So helpful of them. So for any of you working with for example, government agencies, because I know the Forest Service and the EPA uses cost benefit analysis, or benefit cost analysis, as I call it, you're going to need a rate. So here they are, very helpful. Takes the guesswork out of it. And so you see that their nominal rates that they estimated for the 2018 budget, they updated this recently, and I think it's gone up a little bit. I'm not sure. I didn't download it. This is the snapshot I had in my file. So they say the 3-year one is 1.4. And this is based on, again, remember I said some of the risk-free rates were government T-bills, so treasury notes and bonds, because we don't think the government defaults, so they are not risky at all. Pretty low rate. In fact, slightly higher than you're going to get with your savings account. So not much of a rate. And what it's going to do is make these projects really look like something that are almost at the sustainability position, because they're not much bigger than zero. So waiting will not affect a lot of the decisions you're going to make. But you notice that when you got to wait a really long time, that rate doubles. So the government also is not into waiting. So that's kind of an issue, because if you want to be sustainable, particularly environmental projects, as I've talked about, forests, we're waiting, koa trees, 30 to 35 years just to get one that you might get a woodworker interested in buying. But old growth koa, 70 to 100 years. So if you're looking at something like that, 30 years, it's double. And so if we're going to go out 70, 100 years, is that going to be triple? Or so this is kind of some of the problems, because the government is looking ahead on over 30 years. And I think we talked about this last time with Alexis on what really is with some of these government things that are supposed to correct some of these market inequities that are produced when we've got to actually make some of these hard decisions about taxes and things. These are some of the things that will affect us when this government rate is 30 years. You're giving a signal that that's all the government cares about, 30 years. And my suggestion is maybe we need 100 years. So this is difficult. And this is some of the things we have to cope with. On top of that, we have politicians, and what's the timeframes of politicians? Everything they're trying to do, they got to get it done in 2 years, 4 years, or 6 years, because that's when they get reelected. So on top of this situation, we got elected officials that may only, particularly the decision makers in Congress, that are only going to be there 2 to 6 years. So what's their rates going to be? They're not going to look at anything past 6 years, because if they're not elected again, it doesn't matter. So this, on top of that problem, really leads to some difficult issues for political scientists and for community. It is my belief that's why we should move to more indicators on looking at our health, because people will tend to knee-jerk and they won't remember what happened last year. And so they'll make all their decisions based on this week. And I think this is something you now will see in the news with our president as he deals with the reality that some of his past decisions maybe are affecting people's opinions. So everybody's scrambling to get a 1-year favorable outcome, when in fact we should be looking at the next 100 years. So why are we obsessed with this one little thing when we really need a longer time frame? This is the kind of stuff you will see when you look at some of this government information. Now let's come down to this real rate, and you notice, strangely enough, that the 3-year and the 5-year is negative. What does that tell you? I'd rather wait, which is kind of nice if you want to be sustainable. So the real rate is actually looking pretty good here, because it actually reflects something that's a little bit more sustainable. The problem is, how do we deal with that inflation? Because the difference between these two is inflation. Are we happy about inflation? Do we want inflation? It will impact people differently. If you own a lot of resources, you won't be worrying about inflation because your value of resources, if I own land, that value would go up and account for inflation. But if I own cash in the bank, or I don't really kind of have the ability to get in the stock market to try and compensate myself for all this, then I'm poor, I'm going to lose money. Some people only deal with cash, literally only deal with cash. So those people will be negatively impacted. So even there, you see, we have to worry about social equity. So there's just an example of some of the information that you can find if in fact you're a professional consultant. And this is what my students use when they try to analyze a government policy. The government happily gives us rates. And I'm telling you, a business would be much more than this, but this is nice because the government should not be worrying about profits. They should be worrying about social welfare. Okay, so there's that discussion. And when we get done, I'm going to look at an actual spreadsheet, but I want to kind of go over the first assignment because people are having some problems with the first question, and it's asking for some terms that an economist would know, but others may not. I actually gave you on a page number in your book on page 20 that has all this information, but just in case you are unfamiliar with these words, which I think is probably reasonable because our book was written by economists, I want to review what these words mean because this nomenclature is very difficult sometimes. These are not words that most of you are using. Marginal productivity of capital? What in the world is that? What does that mean? Okay, so here's what it means. For every one of those dollars, here's a dollar. I invested it. What did I earn back? What did I earn back? That's what that means. The marginal, for each additional dollar I put in, how much capital or money or profit, actually sort of, positive net benefit, did this produce? So here's the formula. You just take the PV of the total benefits, so the present value of all that string of benefits, you move it back to your zero, and you divide it by the present value of costs. The only difference is that often on the present value of costs, we think of it as negative. But when you do this formula, you don't worry about that negative sign. That kind of disappears. So you need to remember that when you do your calculation. What's the internal rate of return? So this means what's kind of the break even. If the net present value is greater than zero, you earn higher than your discount rate. If it's equal to zero, you just earned what you wanted. If the NPV is less than zero, that means the costs were greater than the benefits. You didn't earn what you wanted. But the question becomes, what did you actually earn? So you can figure that out very, very easily in Excel. But if you're not using Excel, it's very hard, a lot of guessing. So I suggest you use Excel, and it really is the rate that this investment earns, or the break even. There are some problems with that, but we'll talk about that later. And then the net present value, again, is did you earn the rate you wanted? So here's the definition of what that means. So you take the present value of the total benefits, the present value of the total costs at the rate that you wanted. And if the NPV is greater than zero, equal to, or greater than, I can't put equal to with my computer, then you earned what you wanted. And in general, for me, this kind of works because I'm thinking, oh, I made what I wanted. As long as I make what I want, I'm not greedy. It's fine. Let's stop discussing it. I made what I wanted. I'm going to now worry about my other problems. This is not a problem. I made what I wanted. So I like the NPV as a decision tool, but some groups like the IRR, which is a bit problematic. Then the next thing that some groups like is the benefit cost ratio. For every dollar you spent, how much did you earn? So it would be the present value of total benefits divided by the absolute value of total costs. Again, this is where we account for that negative sign you'll have on cost. You just kind of ignore it. So this is an absolute value. I didn't put it here, so I'll go back and put that before I post. But you see here, this sign right here and this right here means absolute value. We're ignoring the negative signs on cost, because otherwise this whole number is going to be negative, and that's not really what we want to do. What we want to do is, for every dollar I spent, what did I earn after accounting for the value of waiting? And then there's the net benefit cost ratio. Okay, this is not common. I don't know why the book's talking about it, but for you to get that question right, all you do is take the MPV and divide it by the absolute value of the present value of total costs. And again, nothing in year zero gets discounted. It's already in year zero, so you don't need to discount it. Most costs are upfront. You spend the money in advance, you buy into the investment, and then you get these returns. So it's all this calculation is usually around the net benefits, not so much cost, but you may have costs that occur in other years other than year zero. Usually though, those are netted out with your benefits. So you don't usually end up with a lot of negative signs after about year 1 or 2. And the reason why you don't is because you invest all this money up front to get these returns over time. So usually those returns over time are positive because the benefits outweigh the costs that occur later. So that's the information you need to do question 1. I've been having some people ask me. It's all found on page 20. And before you do your homework, it's probably a good idea to read the chapters and then try and identify where in that chapter the question comes from. And if you don't know, I'll usually give you the page number. And so this is from page number 30. And then the inflation adjusted investment appraisal is on page 33. So you can read them, but this is how you deal with it. So anyone has any questions on the PowerPoint? Because I want to bring up this Excel spreadsheet so that people can see how to do this risk or the real and nominal example. We had one on assignment 1 and we had one on homework 1. The one on assignment 1 is also mentioned in the FAQs because it's a little funky. But I want to show you what it looks like. So we're going to stop share that. And we're going to start share our Excel file. Okay, so here's our Excel file. And let's move over ourselves. Okay. So here's what we're looking at. You are looking at an investment. So here's the investment. You spend $2,000 and you get a stream of income. And what that stream of income looks like depends on whether you're going to include the effects of inflation or not. So the first thing you got to do is figure out the nominal or money rate and the real rate, because you're trying to decide, do you want to use the real rate or the nominal rate when you discount? You want to see the impacts of it. So here we have a situation where the nominal rate is what we observe. Remember what this PowerPoint said. This nominal rate is what you observe. It's 8%. The inflation rate is 6%. What rate don't we observe? The real rate. You calculate the real rate by subtracting the inflation rate from the nominal rate. So here we have, here I put them in as percentages. When you're doing the MPV, you can put them in as percentages. It doesn't work as well when you try to use that to calculate the effects of inflation. So that's something, this is why I also put them like this. You can do them either way, but when you're calculating the effects of inflation, it doesn't really like to use a percentage. So we have two different options we're exploring. This one right here is the real rate option. And this one here is the nominal rate option. And you notice in year 0, it's exact same numbers because in year 0, inflation is not a concern. So next thing, we've got to construct all the numbers. Well, the unadjusted net benefit is $700 a year. So we can put that straight in. So this is unadjusted net benefit. So this one is the one you use for the real rate option because we're not going to worry about inflation. And you come down here for your real rate, you want to find the NPV. And again, here's our NPV formula. You start with E4, and E4 actually is E4, the real rate. And then I3 to L3 is this string right here. So I am giving you an example. Well, all you got to do is locate the cell and put that in the formula. Again, why do we do that? Totally reduces your work later. Because if a client comes back and says, oh, let's adjust this net benefit because I'm thinking it's going to be more costly, or my workers are really efficient, so maybe we can get this to go up because they're very efficient. And then you just change one cell and then you just recalculate. So it's much better to try and get it to run on the basic facts. And often on these things, on a professional CBA, you'll see it like a legend where they define all these variables, like what's the cost of labor? What's the discount rate? What's the inflation rate? What's the real rate? So it's in one spot and all the formulas drive off of that one cell. So you change that one cell because the client changes their mind. You hit recalculate and everything recalculates. Because this whole mess right here, what do we care about? This number right here, the 665.41, the NPV using the real rate, and the next one that we'll talk about, which is the NPV using the money rate or the nominal rate. That's all we care about. We don't care about all this other mess. Client just wants to know the answer. Which one do I pick? How come do I pick it? They just want you to tell them. So now let's look at the real rate option, which is the next. And all I did was adjust each of these years after year 0 to account for inflation. Let's look at that formula. Again, I feed off the real rate list of net benefits that go to the right. I'm wondering why this is not highlighting. Anyway, normally it highlights too, so you can check your formulas because a lot of fortunes are made and lost if you don't do your Excel formulas properly. So this is our first one. So it's I3, which is that right there is I3. So the next number is 1 plus F5. What is F5? We go 5, F. F is the inflation rate. So 1 plus the inflation rate. And then, so that's right there, 1 plus F5. And then it's raised to I2. What is I2? I2 is right there. So if you don't put the year in the top, it's better if you're doing inflation adjusting because I can just tell it it's this year. So there's 1 year of inflation. It's raised to the I2 power. That's 1 year of inflation. When we do the second year of inflation, we go to J2, which is a 2. So you can just automatically put that in there. You don't even have to think about it. It will do it the right thing. You just put in that formula. This is why I'm doing these spreadsheets for you. But I want you to notice at a 6% inflation rate, this thing starts at $742 and ends at $833. So it looks very attractive. It's much bigger than using the real rate. But it's a bit of an illusion because when we discount, we're also using the higher rate. So what's the real impact? So here, without inflation, we're at $665, and with inflation, we're at $672.75. So which one is better? They're both positive. They're both positive. So either way, this looks like a pretty good investment because it's positive NPV. So whether you adjust for inflation or not, still looks pretty good. The difference is not that much, but if the inflation rate had been higher, I remember when I bought my first house, I think the nominal rate for mortgages was 18% because inflation was huge. It was like 10, 12%. So in that case, I'm really worrying about this. But when the inflation rate is below 4%, that's usually not considered to be particularly significant, and that's why you won't see a big spread. But at the end of the day, it's that compounding that makes the difference. This is exactly the same investment. Why does the NPV look higher for the money rate? You are assuming that the return from this investment, this $700, is going to immediately jump up to reflect that interest rate or that inflation rate. It's immediately going to respond to that inflation rate. I think that's an erroneous assumption in many cases because most prices like this in this net benefit thing kind of lag behind. Costs go up with inflation, and they even sometimes cause inflation. Labor costs, labor will negotiate that in the contract. You go to Safeway, you go to Foodland. What do they say? Oh, costs went up. What do you think? Well, yeah, costs went up. That's not always. How do you know costs went up? They might just raise the price because they're anticipating costs going up. But returns, the money you get back, it takes a while to catch up. So this idea that there's this automatic adjustment that you've assumed with this formula, to me, doesn't seem realistic. So I always go with the real rate, and you notice it's the most conservative. So does anyone have questions? Because we're about done. No questions. Okay, so the last thing, because someone had this question, when you're coming up with this net benefit here, if you want to add them up, like let's say you want to have year 0, or year 1. You might go over here and do it and say, okay, so I've got a cost, I've got a benefit, and you can actually sum. When you sum a 1 and a 2, you can actually just put the formula equals 1 plus 2. So you can enter these in, instead of just putting your number here, you can actually enter in the calculation, and this thing then takes more rows. Normally, I don't do that. Normally, you'll see I'll just have this one here because that's the actual calculation. I'll go somewhere else over here and kind of make this little net benefit. So I'll have like a net if I think it's changing every year, and then I'll sit and calculate it, and then that number, so I might have cost 1, benefit 1, right? And then when I add these up, whatever goes in this cell, then I'll actually have this come from here. So for the undergraduates, I think they're struggling a little bit with their Excel, but this setup of these spreadsheets, if you're going to be a professional consultant, or even if you're going to do it for yourself at home, the way you organize them is important. What data do you think might change? And what data do you think probably won't change? If something is going to change, then you don't want to actually have to go every time and change your whole NPV calculation. It's better to have a little section of key variables and put your key variables in there and run all your formulas off that location, so that you change that one thing, everything can change. And so the setup of these spreadsheets is something else to be thinking about. And when you do your final projects, that's why you have them, is to get the setups. Okay, so that should take care of chapter 2. I think we have one question that's thorny. That would be question 3, the coal price. So if you have the coal price today, right, is $25. So this would be in year 0. What's the coal price in year 1? How do we figure out the coal price in year 1? If we want to use the real rate, we just put $25 because we don't care about inflation. Coal price isn't going up or down. Coal price is 25 bucks. But if you're talking about nominal, then here, then we have to worry about what to put here. I've given you the formula. You just, here, you take the coal price in year 1 and you add in the impact of inflation for 1 year. The question is, what is the inflation rate? The government puts out tons of different inflation rates. In the problem, they give you an inflation rate for the price of coal, and they give you the general inflation rate. Which one would you use? What are we talking about? Coal price. So that's the thing of interest. And if you want to have an accurate NPV, that's the price, or that's the inflation rate that you should probably use to calculate that. And that should take care of your homework 1, assignment 1. I've gone over almost everything. Anyone has questions? IRR, NPV, we did last time. I posted the spreadsheet. So you should be ready to go on all of them. Last chance before we stop sharing and stop our recording. Any questions? Okay, so the YouTube seems to be working. I'm trying to adjust my style to make it a little more friendly, but I do recommend, if need be, that you can open the file, reduce the size, or blow up the size of the YouTube and trying to look at both at once in case you need to stop it. I may be speaking too fast. You may want to be doing your homework at the same time, which is what I recommend, doing your problems as I'm talking, because it's a lot easier sometimes to get them laid out. Okay, no more questions. So I'll be back in a couple of hours and we'll go over chapter 3. That's what we're working on. And it's going to be basically focus on a lecture of chapter 3 and try and give specific homework assignment assistance. So if you've looked at it and you want to ask questions, I think it's not that hard, but the one thing I get is the college question. What do you get when you invest in college? That's a big, I think the last thing I saw was in real life, they're estimating 4 to 6% return on an investment in college, as long as you don't go to the most expensive school on earth. So last chance, questions, anyone? Okay, we're gonna stop recording. Everyone should be really getting done with homework 1, assignment 1, and be moving on to homework 1, assignment 2 by Monday. If you're not, then maybe you need to contact me because maybe you're confused. Thank you.
Thank you.